to show us live?
Yes.
I want to welcome everybody. My name is John Marie Pearson. I handle the social media for Indiana Genealogical Society. This is our very first Facebook Live, so bear with us. We got to get all the kinks out. So we're glad to have all of you guys join us. Before we begin though, I want to remind everybody to mark on their calendars that Indiana Genealogical Society is holding their conference virtually on April 2nd, 2022. Mark your calendars and keep following us for more information. So during this event, before Diane starts, I want to tell everybody, if you have questions, go ahead and put the questions in the comment section below, but put a Q. That'll help it stand out to us to be able to know that you had a question that we'll try to answer at the end of the presentation. So for now, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're so honored to welcome Diane Steproe. And we're going to start off. She's going to tell you a little bit about herself and how she got into learning about orphanages and orphan placements in the 19th and early 20th century. So Diane, if you want to take over now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing. I have a slideshow. Okay. Can everyone see that? I hope. Okay. Well, as was said previously, my name is Diane Steproe. You can reach me at my library where I work, Steproe, spelled Steproe, at jefflibrary.org. I am a Knox County, Indiana native, and I am the Clark County, Indiana County genealogist and the Family and Local History Library librarian, or work in the Family and Local History Library in Jeffersonville Township Public Library in Clark County. And find a little button. And so how I got into this whole realm of orphan and orphanage genealogy was really twofold. I first got into genealogy because of an orphan, because my grandfather had a genetically passed disease and he was orphaned and raised by a variety of people, many of whom had the last name of Smith, and he had been passed around a good deal as a child. And so I had to figure that out, to figure out more about this genetic disease that was afflicting my family. And I wanted to trace that. And honestly, I'm still working on that, but I have found his roots and found a lot of information about his family, who had the wonderful names of Williams, Jones, and Holmes, and Smith. And on top of the orphanage problem, or orphan problem. So that was a mess. But I also had a second great grandfather who was orphaned, and that caused a lot of interesting myths in my family, because people will try to explain away the reason they don't know a person's heritage. They will make things up, and that's where a lot of family myths, I think, come from. Is there were a lot of kids who were orphaned or separated from their families one way or another. And then, as a family history librarian, I have conducted research to write a tour about the orphans and orphanages of Clark County, Indiana, and also sought ways to reconstruct our county's lost orphanage records. And I've assisted countless people with their research into orphaned ancestors here. You will see on the handout that I believe is available to you there is a link to the tour, and I encourage you to look at that to get a snapshot of what the life of an orphan child was like in the 19th and early 20th century, because I go into the biographies of several families and children who were orphaned in Clark County. But I don't think we have time tonight to get through those, but there are some really heartwarming stories and some really heart-wrenching stories, and I hope you take a look at that. So to really get into the program, this is Orphan and Orphanage Genealogy, and I'm going to try to help you find orphans in 19th and early 20th century Indiana. I'm not too sure that my advice will hold true outside of this general area, but I'm going to cover defining an orphan, because it might mean something just a little different than what we've received from Hollywood as orphan means. Finding children raised outside of the home of their biological parents, filling in the stories of children raised outside of the stories, outside of their homes, and finding orphanage records. So I see just locating them on the census or another record is different than filling out their stories, but you can do both. I'm not going to cover adoption genealogy for 20th and 21st century adoptions. I do include a link here and in the handout for those who are wanting adoption records in Indiana. And I will say that DNA works wonders, and I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to county clerk's offices with questions about adoptions if you know where they happened. I'm making some assumptions. I am assuming that you know how to retrieve birth, marriage, and death records, including alternatives like church records. And I'm assuming that listeners know how to retrieve census records. So, if you are not familiar with these kinds of records, I'm happy to work with beginning researchers. Just contact me at the email address that was shared earlier, and I think will be shared in the chat. Now, in the 19th and earliest 20th century, an orphan was any child who grew up outside of the parent's home. So if they weren't raised by their parents for whatever reason, they didn't have to have two dead parents. They were considered an orphan if they needed intervention from an outside person to raise them. And that wouldn't include like people going to a fancy boarding school, but if they were not being cared for by their own parents, then they considered them an orphan. So a lot of the kids that would have been considered orphans then we might talk about as foster children, or just children of single parents, and we'll get into that in a minute. Orphans often were abandoned children or children with no parents for whatever reason, but they also included children who had been removed from their home. So many did have living parents, sometimes two, more often one living parent. You might find your ancestors surrendered their kids to an orphanage and wonder why. And sometimes parents did so voluntarily, especially widowers and widows. But more often they were forced to surrender the kids because of perceived neglect. Single parent status was one of those things that could earn perceived neglect status among a lot of authorities. There wasn't any support for single parents when the children lived in their homes. So many counties just forcibly moved children to the orphanages. Sometimes a parent who was earning enough money to support them, but not enough to hire somebody to come watch them, would be charged for their care. In other cases, the poor parents might even also be institutionalized in a poor farm, depending upon the situation. But there was a social safety net, but it all involved institutions in the late 19th century. And and those were funded by the counties largely and local organizations, not by any sort of large state or federal programs in most cases. Another thing that you need to keep in mind about orphanages is that orphanages were segregated. So if you know a little bit about the person you're seeking, that might tell you where to look. In some cases, orphanages were segregated often by race, sex, religion, or political affiliation. Now, our local orphanages both took Protestant children of both genders here in Clark County, but there were definitely a lot of orphanages that didn't take both genders. There were orphanages that took people of one religion. There were Catholic orphanages. Most, very few orphanages integrated people by race. They were usually very strictly segregated by race. So you'll find Catholic children often went to Catholic orphanages, and sometimes that means that they end up far from home. Protestant children with no known affiliations that would get them into a nicer place would usually go to public orphanages. So like the county orphans home would often house mostly Protestant children. And in most counties, there weren't enough people to separate the boys and the girls, but if they had a large orphanage, many counties would separate them. People who were affiliated with privileged groups could often enter private, better facilities. And what I mean by that is things like the Masons. The Masons operated one of the orphanages here in Jeffersonville in Southern Indiana, and it was a statewide orphanage. And only the children of deceased Masons could be taken into that orphanage. And they got to have a really normal childhood. They had more people working at those places. They got tuition to summer camps, and they got to join the Boy Scouts and be on the yearbook and all of the things that you think of being parts of a normal childhood. They got birthday parties. They got to stay in school until the end of high school at least. So they had pretty good lives. That was not always the case. Most Indiana counties lacked an orphanage for children of color. The only one I am aware of, the only orphanage that accepted children for color I am aware of Indiana was the Indianapolis, I believe it was called the Home for Colored Children. So children had to be placed far from their support networks, or they were placed in foster care. In our area, we have a lot of newspaper accounts we have saved to document what's happened to the local African-American children who were orphaned. They were frequently placed with white strangers in this area, even when their relatives wished to foster them, and the officials often assumed there was something greedy about the African-American relatives who claimed a child. There were county support payments that went with a child, but they didn't make that assumption about white foster parents. So you find kids separated from their support networks one way or another. That's one thing to be aware of when you're looking through the census and you find your African-American relatives with a strange family. That's probably an orphan, and they're probably placed there by the county. or very possibly. I always hate to say something happens is always true because, genealogy, there's always an exception. Now, communities placed orphans in a lot of different places. Orphan asylums are the first thing you're going to think of. They called them asylums, not always orphan homes, but orphan asylums or orphanages. Also, children who were over 12 offered apprenticeships and jobs, boarding houses, foster homes, hospitals, jails, and juvenile detention facilities. And we'll get into each of those a little bit more. But it may be a surprise that they were placed in jails, but when there was no room in the orphanage here, or when we didn't have an orphanage, we frequently found kids placed in jail. And even when there were orphanages, sometimes older children who were in families that were being split up because of neglect or abuse, the older children sometimes were put in jail with parents. It's something you will find, and it's surprising and shocking to us now, but that was considered pretty normal. So one thing, people tend to think that childhood has remained very stable, but the idea of who is a child has changed over time. So people have become more aware of child development, more aware that not everybody grows up at the same rate, and that most people aren't very grown up yet when they're in their 20s. And as a result, they're becoming more patient and generous with young people. Very, very young children, babies were always met with compassion throughout the history of orphanages, but up until the 30s, most orphanage systems saw children who had passed the age of 12 as little adults. And that goes back to the colonial period, where they were apprenticed out at the expense of the community. And in the late 19th century, throughout the 19th century, they would send them off to work as unskilled laborers or to learn a trade. And that wasn't really meant to be mean. They were thinking they're going to give these kids some skills. And it didn't always work out that way, though. The consequences to orphans were pretty severe. And, if you do this kind of research, you're going to run into some really, really sad stories. Some orphan children who were placed out to work were the victims of predatory adults. These people would use the kids' labor and accept payments from the county for their upkeep, but they make little return. They don't really teach them much. They don't really do much upkeep for the children in some cases. And sometimes they are predatory in other ways. We have found cases of children being sexually assaulted, and even in the 19th century, when they didn't report on those things very much, they might say an outrage was committed against the child. We have one case where we've followed the orphan through court because after her abuse, her behavior was pretty wild, and after all the abuse she'd been through in a placement to work, and she was tried for insanity. They thought about putting her away as an insane person, but they decided that she was just feeling the effects of the outrages against her. That's what the court said. So just be aware. You might find some things you'd rather not hear if you're very sensitive. It can be a difficult subject to find out everything that happens to an orphan. On the other hand, if they stayed in the orphanage, they were more likely to die of a disease than the children who were placed out. There are a number of books, and I mentioned one of them in the handout, at least one of them, that have detailed the known mortality in orphanages, but it was very high. And the rate of abuse was pretty high both by staff and in many orphans' recollections. The older children were sometimes abusive to the younger children, especially in situations where they weren't well monitored. They were often undereducated and separated from their family support networks. So when they graduate from care, they frequently turn to crime, and we find a lot of our local orphans later doing time in state institutions and local institutions. So, that makes great records for genealogists, but it is very, very tragic. So to find an orphan, you want to start with the basics, and I'll cover each of these in more detail as we go. Family stories, conflicting birth, marriage, and death records, census results, articles, and missing branches in your DNA results. So I couldn't resist this picture that has nothing to do with my presentation, except they're an older couple, but older relatives may tell stories about their stays in orphanages, and a family story may tell of distant ancestors who were orphaned. So that's a good hint, but as we know, family stories can be wrong. But usually when your older relatives are talking about their personal stays in orphanages, that's a good reason to suspect that you need to be researching an orphanage and orphans. Conflicting birth, marriage, and death records can be a real hint. Orphans often don't know their family histories well and may offer different names for their parents on different records, or no names at all. So on a marriage record that should have their parents' names, they won't give it, or they'll give something that doesn't jive on two different records. And they don't tell stories about their family to their kids as much if they're orphaned. So when you're getting back a few generations and you haven't known the person personally, though, you might find that their kids put the wrong names on their death certificates, or their kids have conflicting ideas about who the grandparents were. And that's a hint that they might be orphans. I know in my case, my great-great-grandfather, one of his children put two names on the death certificate that were both real people. And the child from which I'm descended, his daughter, told us that he was, I hate to even spread this, but said that he was the child of his father was a French trapper, and his father was French, but not a trapper. And he met a Native American woman, and they had an affair, and she died in childbirth. And that wasn't true either. Neither child had it right, and I eventually did solve it. But that was a hint that there was this disagreement in who the grandparents were. And they really, nobody got both of them right. But the records were out there. You might find census records that tell you something. You may find your ancestor or ancestor's siblings enumerated in an institution during the childhood years. And I want you to think carefully about the census, because it's only taken every 10 years. So let's say your ancestor is the oldest, and they're not in the orphanage when you look at them, but all of their younger siblings were. Something has gone wrong there. So you want to, that's one reason why you want to find the whole family. And then you'll know, you'll be able to help reconstruct that story. You'll know that you've got more things to look for when you find siblings in an orphanage, even if your direct ancestor isn't. Because let's just say they were all orphaned 9 years ago, and your ancestor has turned 21 and is no longer in need of care, and the younger siblings are still there. You wouldn't find them if they were, you wouldn't find yours ever in the census if they were orphaned and grew out of the orphanage in between census records. You might also find your ancestor's siblings your ancestor or your ancestor's siblings enumerated in a stranger's home. They might be listed as an adopted child, an apprentice, or a servant, but during the childhood years. So, adopted child, that says, oh yeah, I've got something going on here. This is probably an orphan situation. But apprentice and servant may not say that to us, but people didn't usually send their 12-year-olds out to work. It was more often, if the 12-year-old was out to work, there was usually some sort of official undertaking to get this child taken care of outside of the home. And always look for the siblings, and also look for the parents. I probably should have added that. Look for the parents, because a lot of times you'll find a living parent, and that's if there are one or more living parents that are enumerated separately from the kids, the kids are in the orphanage or at apprenticeships, and the parents are living. That's something you want to look into. There may be a court record there. Articles are great. That's how we found a great number of orphans here. Gossipy old newspapers tell all about area families. Oh yeah, Joe's kids were in rags and the county took them away. It'll say things like that. Trade and organization magazines mention when members leave orphans. I've seen a Methodist minister's trade magazine that mentioned that a minister had passed and left his children orphaned. Any book with biographies will mention when a subject has been an orphan child. And this is an example of that. This is Ben Taylor, who was raised in the orphanage here in Jeffersonville. He was in the public orphanage. He had a living father who couldn't care for him. They were reunited later in life, but and Ben went on to be an orphanage director and a pastor and a writer. And we found him in Indiana Authors and their books, just searching through all kinds of things for local orphans. But one of his books is about his brother dying in the orphanage. So it's not an all happy story. And there's more about DNA than I could ever discuss tonight, and I'm no expert. But if you find people in your DNA that have a name, a lot of people with a name that doesn't jive, that doesn't go with what you expected, that's a hint that you might have a family branch that you didn't know about because there was an orphan somewhere. So you have an orphan. How do you get those orphanage records? Well, we don't have them here. We really don't have actual books in Clark County, at least not at this time. I'm hoping they show up in an attic or a broom closet in the courthouse or something, but we don't have the records. And you just can't expect to find them in every case. People don't save stuff they ought to save all the time, or they put it in weird places. But do start out looking in obvious places. There are plenty of orphanage records in local libraries and courthouses. Some have even been reproduced. In Knox County, the I know there is a published book of the Catholic, inhabitants of the Catholic orphanage in Knox County. Excuse me, I need to take a drink. And while you're looking at records, look beyond the names and ages and try to learn the conditions of your child ancestors. And I'll talk more about that. So what we've got an index of orphans that is ever growing here. We've grabbed them from all kinds of different places, and that's one reason you'd want to call our our library, even though we don't have orphanage records, we have records of orphans because we've reconstructed them from other places. Another place you want to go besides the library, however, is the Indiana Board of Public Charities. And that will help you reconstruct all kinds of things. The annual report of the Indiana Board of Public Charities, it's linked here and in the handout, will tell you how the children and penal inmates lived. And remember, kids could end up in juvenile detention or even in grown-up jail if they were orphaned in the past. So it'll tell you all kinds of information about those institutions and help you make that story. You might want to see also the Indiana Archives and Records Administration indexes, and those are linked in your handout. And there are letters about individual orphans, and we are still going through all the letters, the indexed letters in that to see who is from Clark County. But you can search by county. You can search by name, and it's just a wonderful resource. And mostly they're letters to and from Board of Charities members from the counties and back and forth about the kids. So it'll be like, I was sending John Smith to Indianapolis for an apprenticeship. Will there be somebody there to receive him at the train station? And they write back and correspond as to whether that will happen. But the copies, the correspondence are saved there, and there are a lot of letters. And then licensing records and other correspondence are in an Indiana Archives and Records Administration box collection, child caring institutions, private secure facilities, group homes, and child placing agencies, 1882 to 1949. And you can get a description of that collection at the link given. And a lot of these things you will have to eventually, if you want to see the real document, you are eventually going to end up for the last two items at the archives, but you can get an idea of what's there before you go. You don't have to walk in blind. And I'd encourage you to contact, if you plan a trip, to contact the archives and get everything arranged before you go. The Indiana Bulletin of Charities and Corrections has a lot of information that will help you construct that story. You can find laws, speeches, and other information about orphanages and possible places where orphans might be found beginning in 1897 and published quarterly. And that's in Google Books. I believe it's also in Hathi Trust, if you're familiar with that resource, but there's a link to Google Books. The courthouse has a surprisingly large amount of information about orphans. We have a bit of a problem here because the 1937 Great Flood of the Ohio and Mississippi drowned our courthouse. And so any records that we have that were in ink are runny. And they're still there. They're just hard to read. But I've been fighting my way through it slowly. Pencil records are still there in pretty good shape. They will survive a flood. Just a little hint there if you want your records to survive a flood. But juvenile court records often note when a child has been assigned to an orphanage because of parental neglect, mismanagement, or poverty. And so you're not going to be able to see all of those. Obviously, there's some juvenile records that are sealed, but if we're talking 19th century, you're probably going to be able to see those. I'm not sure that they exist still in every county, but I would certainly check because they exist here and they in Clark County, and they are just amazing for finding these things. The juvenile court records also note when a child has been sent to a reformatory or jail. So there are a lot of placements in juvenile detention centers noted. It notes where they go and how long they're sentenced, so you know when they're going to get out. Probate records sometimes detail provisions for surviving children, so you want to look at probate. A lot of Indiana has been digitized, but not all. So another reason you might want to head to a courthouse. And criminal proceedings against adults often provide clues that suggest orphanage placement. And I said, if dad does time for murdering mom, what becomes of the children? And I'm thinking of a specific case here in Clark County. There were actually several, but one I looked into quite a bit where on Christmas Eve, mom and dad had an argument and dad shot mom in the chest in their restaurant. All of the children were sent to Knox County because they were Catholic. And so this was quite a lot of work to find them because they were not here. But once we realized that our local orphanage was usually placing Catholic children, or excuse me, our local courts were usually placing Catholic children in the Catholic orphanage, not in our local orphanages, then we knew where to look because there was a large Catholic orphanage in Vincennes, Knox County. If you're lucky, you may find actual orphanage records. And I said, look at the library. You also want to look at sponsoring organizations. You might contact a church or a Catholic archdiocese if you believe they're Catholic, a Methodist archives if you believe they're in a Methodist orphanage. The Masons, if you believe that they were in the Masons orphanage, and so on. But there were a lot of organizational orphanages. Even the Klan, the KKK, had an orphanage. That was in Ohio, but there were a number of organizational orphanages around the country that were pretty well kept. You would want to check courthouses because the records could be deposited in a courthouse, state and local historical societies, and libraries. So be sure that you look around. Don't give up because they weren't in the first place you looked. And I always tell people, I'm not in genealogy to fill in slots on the pedigree chart. I want to know more about people. I want to have life stories. And someday I'll retire and actually write them all down instead of having piles in my basement. But if you really want to know more about your ancestor, you're going to have to know the history. And so I provided on the handout a list of links to various resources for learning more about orphanages in general. There has been a lot of study of orphanages, and there are some orphanages with very good records intact that they've been able to use as case studies. So you can find out a lot about what your ancestor might have been facing. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and please let me know if you have any questions. And once again, my email is dstepro@jefflibrary.org. And I'm going to stop screen sharing. And John Marie, do we have any questions?
Yep, we do. We have, let's see, looks like we have 2 so far. First one was, do you happen to know names of orphanages in Evansville, Indiana, and if there's records?
I don't. I'm sorry, but I would not hesitate to put a call into the Willard Library in Evansville. They have a very good genealogy library there, and I've dealt with them on other questions, and they're very, very responsive.
Okay, and then the other one's also a location. Names of orphanages in Connorsville, Indiana in the late 1960s.
Oh, that's out of my time and my place. I don't, yeah, I don't know. Definitely more of a early 20th century and 19th century person, but
right.
Maybe in Fayette County.
Yeah, maybe the historical society there would probably know.
Yeah, I would definitely contact somebody local. That would always be my first advice for any sort of sticky question, as somebody who is on the ground there. Usually their local library or historical society will know. They fielded this question before.
Let's see, I'm double checking. I think that was all of them. Okay, yeah, and I will post Diane's email there. If you have any questions, you can reach out to her. Yeah, that was all the questions we had. And I mean, you gave a lot of great information and tips on where they can even start to look, because you can take this information and take it to other counties too. So we thank you very much. That there was a lot of information, and we will, one of the glitches we learned is we can't post the handout while we're on live. So we will be posting the handout to the website as soon as we're done. So that was one glitch we learned, but
It'll be like on a Facebook post.
Yeah, we'll make it on a Facebook post. And so I'll be able to put it there. So everyone will be able to pull it up there and get it. But again, thank you so much. If people have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Diane. If anyone else happens to know the answers to some of these questions, don't hesitate to comment below, reply. And also, we'd like to ask everyone if you're watching this when it's not live, if you could just put in replay, because we're just kind of trying to keep track of numbers and see how everything's doing. But again, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And this was a lot of information.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was really, really good to get it put together.
And thank you for being our first live.
Thank you so much.
You did great. Yeah. And we'll be doing another live. We're gonna do it once a month, first Tuesday of every month at 6:30. Next is, I just had it right here, is we're gonna have how to use lore chords for land patents. So we hope everyone will join us again. And that's it for our first presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you guys next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.